Now, what happens in ministry is some certain attachments form to certain people who are supposed to be there for you. Some certain loyalties form, some certain expectations form. And if you're not careful, if you're not really, can I say this, guarded with your soul, you will minister out of a place, not necessarily out of a place of bitterness or brokenness, but maybe just out of a place of half-heartedness. It's where you're going through the motions and discharging your duties, and you're doing it from a distance. From a distance. But a couple of times you invested in people and they left. So you're kind of hesitant to invest in somebody again because I put 3 years into them, and what good did that do me? Y'all ain't gonna talk to me in main stage session 3? You're gonna look at me like this never happened to you before? Like nobody ever let you down. Like nobody ever twisted it, nobody ever didn't appreciate you. And it's little things. One guy called it death by 1,000 paper cuts. I don't know what you call it, but it happens to your soul and it happens deep down. And you can even disguise it to where no one knows that it's really happening. And you start leading from an emotional distance, from a spiritual distance. And it's not that you're not there, you're there. David was there. He was back in Jerusalem, but he wasn't in his right place. And see, we should probably go to Israel if we really want to do this message right, because you would have to see how the city gates worked in Jerusalem. So there's like an outer wall and an inner wall. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem, you've probably seen, they have some archaeology that supports this exact replica of the wall has been found on several sites, and it's like the wall that would go around Jerusalem, where there's an outer wall that you can see, and then there's an inner wall that provides an extra level of defense, but there is a space between those gates. And in ancient times, a lot of the times, between the gates is where the commerce would happen. There would be trades happening between the gates. There would be situations where judges would set up seats between the gates, and they would have hearings. When someone had a grievance, they would bring the grievance between the gates. The prophets would often prophesy between the gates, between the outer wall and the inner wall. I'm trying to give you a principle from David's life that might apply to you where you are today, because everybody has an outer wall that people see. Our church has one. Your church has one. Matter of fact, every life has an outer wall. It's called Instagram. And so it's called Facebook. And there's an outer wall. Maybe that represents the surface. Maybe that represents what you wore. Maybe that represents how you smell. Maybe that represents, your fade. Maybe that represents for you the way you speak. Maybe that represents your image. There's the outer wall, our logo and our branding and our website, and all this stuff is wonderful. I think that you really have to care about that. Some people will not take you seriously, and they will not see the contents that you have to offer on the inside, because they can't get past the package that is sloppy on the outside. So it ought to be done with excellence, and it ought to feel like you care about it, and it ought to be tucked in, and it ought to be buttoned down, and it ought to be done right. That's the outer wall. And then there's the inner wall, which represents the defense, and maybe that represents the systems of your church and the organization, and maybe that represents, your org chart and all these things that are important. But every church has an inner wall and an outer wall, and a line of defense on the inside and a line of defense on the outside. But that's not really what I want to talk about in the last session, because every church has a space between the gates, a space between your inner workings and your outer image, where decisions are really made. The space between the gates. And in the space between the gates, not only were judgments made, but there was a special seat reserved for the king. And when the king would sit in his seat between the gates, the people would come to him. And when they had an issue, they would come to him. And when something needed his full attention, they would come to him. But see, David wasn't in the gates. David had left his place because his pain was so great. David had left his place perhaps because his confidence had left him. And Joab comes to him and says, if you don't get back out there, I promise you, you are going to lose everything that God has given you if you don't get back out to the gates. Now let me teach a little bit. Get back in the gate. So that means you got to check your gratitude. Write it down, gratitude. This isn't on the screen. I didn't even know I was going to preach it till I grabbed the mic. Check your gratitude. Because I remember this one scripture we quote all the time that says, enter his with. Gratitude is the gateway drug. You know that. So here's how you check what's happening between the gates in your ministry. Are people saying get to, or are they saying got to? Because if they're saying got to where they used to say I get to, you've got a gap in the gates. Let me tell you a key question to let you know that you've got a problem in the gates, between the gates. I'm not talking about the outer wall of the ministry. That can look fine. Nobody sees that. I mean, it's great. The wall looks good. The building is paid for. Offerings coming in. Great. Okay, I'm not even talking about the inner wall. I'm not even talking about your financial systems and your accounting. That can all be good. But it's the space between the gates. And when you have staff members saying, is this mandatory? Do spouses have to come? When you have a bare minimum mentality in the gates, it's a matter of time before the nation scatters. You cannot be a unified staff with a bare minimum mentality. Not around purpose. So check the gratitude, because remember, the gates were the place where they would bring the grievances, and they would come before the judges and they would say, hey, what do you think about this? Now let me ask you a question. Within your staff and within your leadership culture of your church, is there more gratitude than there are grievances? If there are more grievances than there are gratitude, and if the people that you have leading are entertaining and feeding into the grievances, you have a problem in the gate, and you'd better get back in your seat before you lose the whole thing. And you have to watch this in your own spirit too. Because it's not just other people you have to control. You have to watch your own vocabulary, your own language, what you entertain, the way that you go into rooms like you're doing God a favor to show up on Sunday morning. Don't even let it in your gate. You have to really watch yourself on this. You can't start thinking that, somehow God is indebted to you because he recruited your illustrious service into the royalty of his courts. You don't want to allow any of that into your mentality. You want to stay in a space where you do not permit anything that resembles ingratitude to come out of your mouth, because the mouth is the gateway. So squash it at the gate or it will destroy you in the battle. Sometimes you got to look at yourself and go, really? That's how I check myself. Really? You really want to do this right now? You really want to complain that you got to preach again? Because I guarantee you there's a 25-year-old who wants it like you used to want it, and I'll give him the mic if you don't want it. But see, if you don't challenge your sense of gratitude, you will begin to take for granted what was once such a joy, and you'll be weeping over Absalom, and the people are waiting for you to take your place in the gate. So check your gratitude, and check it regularly, and command it to come front and center. I command my heart to be grateful. Gratitude isn't a feeling, it's a decision. This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it.